Friends, welcome. My name is Paul Boite, and I am going to be chairing this session. We've had, as I understand it, a great day, a focused day. Now we're beginning to draw the strands together with a view to, well, it's entitled Referencing Today and Tomorrow, but what we're seeking to do in this session is to build on what you've been doing during the day, but above all, take the Pan-African agenda reflected in the All Africa's People Conference in 1958 and say, what's the relevance of that conference and the struggles that it represented? What's its relevance today? And how do we use the events of 1958 and the lessons learned from 1958? How do we use that in order to take the agenda forward today? And by way of brief prefacing opening remarks, unlike my distinguished elders on either side of me, who were active participants in 1958, I was a schoolboy. My father and mother were active participants. My father as a lawyer for the Convention People's Party, my mother as an anti-colonial activist. My father subsequently became a cabinet minister in Dr. Nkrumah's government, and my mother a head teacher in Accra. But in addition to the roles they played at the conference, they were both close friends of George and Dorothy Padmore, and came to be close friends of the Du Boises. So my memory is entirely seen through going to have Coca-Cola and Ovaltine biscuits with George and Dorothy Padmore, attending the exhibits that a number of you will recall were surrounding the conference hall. Because a critical part of the development of what came to be known in that famous speech as the African personality was getting all of us at that time, young and old alike, to have a different view of what it was to be an African. We had been subjugated mentally by the colonial powers, and what Kwame Nkrumah sought to do in some of those external exhibitions, if you remember, was to demonstrate what the significance of the ruins of Great Zimbabwe was, to demonstrate the contribution to maths and to learning of peoples of Africa, North and South, and also and particularly to get us to have a greater understanding of what it was to unlock the potential of Africa as a contributor to the world and its thinking going forward, and to the task both of liberation and of reconciliation and peacekeeping. That was a very important part of the agenda at that time. And the meetings and the gatherings were for a young boy. I can still see in my mind those paintings, which were distinguished because they had black faces in roles which, frankly, we had never seen in any textbook or any work of literature at the time. Don't forget, then...
The paintings were made by an African-American called L. Sweeting.
There you are. We both have that memory. It shows you just how powerful, how very powerful they were. So that was my memory of the conference. That and stamps. I was an avid stamp collector, and I still have the set of stamps in my collection. Ambassador Amamu, Uncle Joseph, as I called him then. I still have the collection of that first day cover and that set of stamps that was issued to commemorate that conference. But what I recall is the excitement. What I recall is a sense of anticipation. And when you read, as no doubt you have, and you reflect on the speech that Kwame Nkrumah gave on that occasion, a speech, frankly, that I think bears rereading and reassessing today, you see within it how his focus was on what he called the political kingdom. But I think the mistake, frankly, that was made was to believe that with the coming of the political kingdom, all else would flow from that. That has not been the case. We have won in Africa the political kingdom, if by that you mean getting rid of the colonial, and the racist oppressor. Yes, they've been got rid of from political governance. Their power in terms of economic governance remains, and the unfinished business of Africa is the economic emancipation of Africa. That we are a long way from. And it seems to me that as we look forward, we need to reflect on that conference in terms of what it had to say about those issues of economic independence, and importantly, what it had to say about something that continues to bedevil our continent to this day, which is internal disputes which have a tribal and an ethnic basis. Those disputes continue to this day. They are exploited to this day as those who will continue to seek to exploit us economically also foment and fuel those ethnic and tribal divisions. That's happening on the continent as we speak. And we need gathering together as we are as civil society persons. And that's another very important strand of the All Africa People's Conference, the recognition on the part of the political leadership of the struggle at that time of the role of civil society. Civil society needs to continue to assert itself. Civil society continues to need to be in partnership with political leadership, with faith leadership, with traditional leadership. We need to be as one in order to complete the unfinished business of emancipation of the continent and its peoples. That's enough from me. Let me give a particularly warm welcome to our three interlocutors this evening, but to say also importantly that it's yes, of course, about this distinguished panel, but it's also about continuing the conversation. And I don't want anyone in 45 minutes to have left this room without a sense that they've got whatever it is in their hearts and minds, whatever it is on their chest, off it and out and amongst us all as a stimulus to action going forward. So thank you and welcome. If I can turn, first of all, immediately for some thoughts to you, Cameron Lee.
Thank you, Lord Paul. It's always great to see you. I don't know whether you remember a white sports car parked outside your house around 1958. I was made the liaison officer between the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation and the minister. The minister was so competent that I parked outside the house and he never called me. So I had to go back to my work. One thing that I would like to say as a follow-up to what I said in the morning session is this. Nkrumah was initially for peaceful struggle against colonialism. He believed strongly in it. But once he had begun to backpedal, he went to the opposite extreme. He set up a military base at a place called Obenimasi in Ashanti. We had East German military traders, Chinese military traders, Russian military traders. They all came and they were teaching people like Samora Machel. I got this from his own mouth, to come and be trained there. And because of the ideals of Nkrumah that they observed, being brought there at Ghana government expense, being taught efficiently by experts. When Samora Machel went to fight in Mozambique, he linked up with ZANU, Robert Mugabe's party, and people like Tongogara, if you know what I'm talking about. They were there together and they fought together in the mountains between Zimbabwe and Mozambique. That was amazing. You had African unity in miniature there, and with potent force, because the Mozambicans began to hurt the Portuguese. Same thing happened. Amilcar Cabral sent some people to Benmasi. Again, he came to Ghana. I interviewed him on television, and he paid tribute to the contribution that Ghana was making in terms of efficient training. We had an army, but Nkrumah didn't use our own people. Brought people who were better trained so that our army too could benefit from their expertise. It was amazing. Now, the other thing is this, that whilst we were doing this, human nature came to try and defeat Nkrumah. He was very unlucky in the people he got to succeed George Padmore. Can you imagine George Padmore, an idealist, absolutely erudite person with all these contacts, being succeeded by an ex-serviceman called A.K. Barton, who had been his secretary, nothing more. As soon as Padmore died, Barton worked his way gradually. He set up one committee, then he would tell Nkrumah that the committee wasn't doing well and it would be dissolved. And so until he became director of the Bureau of African Affairs. And I tell you that Nelson Mandela came to Ghana in 1962, and this idiot did not allow him to see Nkrumah.
Now, Cameron, I want you in 2 minutes to give us a sense going forward of what you see. Answer the old Leninist question. What's to be done? We've had the history, now what's to be done?
The thing to be done is, first of all, to rid Africa of raw materials. In the sense that...
Rid Africa of a reliance on raw materials?
No, I don't want the term raw materials to be heard there at all. We can have small units producing cocoa powder instead of cocoa beans. Then we go on and do chocolate. These days with refrigerated aircraft, why do we fear that if we produce chocolate and send it to Europe, it will melt before it gets there? That's the argument that the Cadburys and other people were using all the time. It's nonsensical.
Okay, so manufacture, yeah.
Yes.
To get that, one other thing.
Pay attention to your people. Okay. The welfare of your people. The education of your people. They are the biggest capital you've got. African leaders, and especially the African bourgeoisie, is so completely short-sighted that it doesn't know that its own future, its own welfare depends on an educated and efficient...
Okay, Cameron, so manufacture and education, building human capacity.
Yes.
Do I gather from that that you believe that Nana Akufo-Addo is an Nkrumahist? Because those are the two specific programs of the current president of Ghana: manufacture and education. So it isn't a trick question. I mean, I myself happen to be very strongly. I don't play any part in Ghanaian politics, but I'm very strongly supportive of Nana Akufo-Addo's two priorities because they are in complete accordance with yours, and they're in accordance also with mine. But I mean, it's a very interesting link, isn't it, that we've had to wait the length of time that we have to have a government in Ghana and a head of state who have given such prominence to the issue of manufacture and human capacity building. Have you got any comments you'd like to make on that?
Absolutely. The thing is, with the greatest respect, it is so obvious. It is so obvious. Why should we be sending cocoa to Belgium, Netherlands, United States?
Good. Well, the good news is, and I think it's actually quite important that we should be spreading this good news is, that Ghana is now producing high quality cocoa products. And when the British High Commissioner had a birthday party for Prince Charles just 3 weeks ago, they were serving chocolates manufactured in Ghana to the same quality as those that are now capable of being brought on any high street anywhere that bear the hallmark made in Belgium. The big issue, and I hesitate to mention it, but I have to, the big issue going forward, the one that we don't talk enough about in the context of Brexit, is what are the new trading arrangements going to do to support that sort of manufacture? Because at the moment, the way that the European Union has structured its economic partnership agreements is actually to make it hard for Africans to produce the sort of high-quality chocolates that you rightly draw upon as your example. So I leave you with that thought. You're going to hear a lot about Brexit, even more in the next few days. But we do need to think about the potential opportunities that it presents for Africa, and not just see it in the context of potential disaster for Britain. Thank you very much, Cameron. Ambassador, if I can now, Professor Habre Selassie, if I can now turn to you and ask you to give your perspective, both on the events of 1958, but also to set that in terms of its relevance to the exciting things that appear to be happening today in Ethiopia, in terms of its own internal political situation, but also, and importantly, in terms of its relationship with Eritrea and its neighbours. And we're really delighted that you're able to spend time with us today. So over to you.
Thank you, my lord. Let me first of all say that your father was my senior by 2 years in law school. Oh yes.
At King's?
Yes. And when I came to Accra in 1958, he was already up there. So he saw me one day and he said, ah! And he came and embraced me. He said, brother! As Ghanaians always say, brother. So there's a connection. Connection.
Brother.
Your father was a good man. He was a good elder to me. Well now, 1958 was to me a threshold of a new life, of a awakening of African continent and reckoning of the colonial powers. And Nkrumah personified that wonderful event and its potential. I don't know whether you were here this morning when I spoke, but I met Kwame Nkrumah when I was a student here at University College. And he came to address us WASU, West African Students Association, and he captured our imagination there immediately. Not only was he eloquent and informative, but there was a charisma there, which you can't miss. A charisma of passion, a charisma of dedication, a charisma of diabolical determination. I use the word diabolical advisedly because arrayed against him and the rest of us were powerful forces. Not only European colonialists, but American imperialism, and he knew it. But he was so optimistic and positive, he didn't even regard them as a challenge. So he was focused on the future at that speech. And then at his famous speech in Accra, I cannot reproduce here. It's not humanly possible for me to reproduce here the drumming of the drums, the people dancing in their countries. Nkrumah himself joining them and dancing. Ghana, land of freedom, freedom. Nkrumah, star of Ghana. We were captured.
Well done.
Those were really days difficult to recapture. What remains with us, with me certainly, is a sense, an aspect of that passion. I'm still passionate for African unity. When I attended the Nyerere conference 6 years ago to receive an award, to deliver a speech, I was asked to speak about Pan Africanism. And I divided it into two parts. Historically, how it developed, who were the intellectual forces behind it, how it developed, and so on, both in the continent and in the diaspora. The second part of my lecture, which if I will find in this volume, Sudan has, Reimagining Pan-Africanism. There are 5 of us who were invited to give the lecture. The first was the great Ole Soyinka, followed by the late Samir Amin, yours truly was the third, and then Michel Mugo of Kenya, great literary person. And finally, Tandika. Where is Tandika? Who's supposed to be here? Anyway, they decided to publish it as a volume. And I'm told that it is doing rather well among the African Union circles, which is good. Us academics like, I repeat, like to be quoted and to be told how wonderful we are.
That's not limited to academics.
That's beside the point, but at least the messages contained in that book, I think, are, in my view, with all modesty, very important. Okay.
Ethiopia today and its nakedness.
Let me just say a couple of things before that. In the conference, there was a gallery of young people, hundreds of them. And as I was speaking, I derived energy from them. So I ad-libbed and decided to add something, challenging them to challenge us, their elders. Support us, respect us, but challenge us, That's very important, the young. The future is yours. Africa's future is in your hands. There is no country without the youth. And therefore, I appeal to the young. I heard the challenge to my brother earlier on. It was the privilege of youth to make a mistake. And if you can learn from the mistake, fine. Ethiopia. What's happening in Ethiopia is exciting. When Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed declared that he is now going to use love, the concept of love, as a weapon of politics, we're excited. It's exciting. I mean, Jesus Christ spoke of love, and all great religious leaders talk of love, but not as a weapon of politics. This is exciting. This is exciting. And to illustrate his point, he ordered the release of all political prisoners, everybody, except those who committed murder. He decided to unfreeze the relationship between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which had been outstanding for over 15 years, and decided to declare peace between the two. He invited the Eritrean president, Isaias Afwerki, to join him. So, two things. First of all, Ethiopia is undergoing some exciting changes with a lot of challenges. At the same time, as an Eritrean, who was also the largest Ethiopian, we're all the largest Ethiopian, But by choice, I became Eritrean. And I fought for the self-determination of Eritrea against the military government. When I resigned from the position of Attorney General of the Emperor, it was on dispute over the question of Eritrea, mainly, all the human rights issues at large. But therefore, I said today, the classic contest between power and liberation, between the notion of power being used by the politicians and the notion of values, liberty, freedom, which is our weapon as intellectuals. All right. Now, as Eritrea is concerned, I have a problem because the two leaders have embraced each other. Prime Minister Abiy has declared Isaias as his hero, his elder brother, and he's embraced him totally. I've known Isaias, we were fighters together. I have never seen him laugh so happy in Ethiopia.
And when he got home?
He seems to have, he's really a tragic figure. He fought tooth and nail, led brilliantly a nation from rule to independence, and then he proceeded to destroy the very object that he produced. He divided the people. He destroyed families. When people saw that, they said, you know, he never knew about him. He was a traitor anyway from the beginning. He was an agent of Ethiopian forces, of the American CIA and the Israeli Mossad. I didn't accept that. I did not, because I saw him fight for freedom. Now that he's now actually handed over Eritrea on a silver platter to Abiy Ahmed. Now, we may all want to be united, not only as Ethiopian Eritreans, but as Africans. That's our objective. But at what cost? Who is doing that? The Eritrean people are totally out of the picture on this. So, I'm going to challenge my brother, young enough to be my son, Abiy Ahmed, to rethink. Embrace your brother by all means, but don't forget the people of Eritrea.
Thank you very much. Professor Hakim Haji. Thank you very much indeed for spending time with us today and for giving us a benefit of your thoughts. Will you please address the events of 1958 very much within the context of the challenges of the present?
Thank you for that introduction. I have the distinction of, I was around in 1958, but I wasn't in Accra at that time, so I can't speak from that perspective. I don't think I need a microphone.
We need it.
You cannot. We need it. Need it for what? Okay, microphone is, I normally consider that an insult, but as I'm in this company, I'll use it. As I said, I wasn't in Accra in 1958, so I can't speak from that perspective. I speak as a historian of Pan Africanism. I won't go into what I do outside the academy, as this is an academic occasion. I will stick to that. Some of you will have seen that I've just written a book about the history of Pan Africanism. I start in the 18th century and I end with the AU. So, what I want to say first of all about 1958, a lot of things have been said about it. And so rather than going back, let me talk about the present and the future. And the thing that strikes me as being most significant about 1958 is the slogan, hands off Africa. And this seems to me to be, is this a 1958 slogan or is this a 2018 slogan? So it strikes me that it's a 2018 slogan, because if we look at what is going on, in general nowadays everyone was talking this morning about 1884, which was almost the culmination of the first scramble for Africa. Today people talk about the new scramble for Africa. And if we look at what is going on, we see the contention between all the major powers in Africa. In fact, one of the demands of the 1950s was that actually the removal of foreign military presence in Africa. Today we see more and more military bases in Africa, far more military bases in Africa now than there were in 1958. I think the US has, over 40 bases in Africa. Britain has bases, China has bases, Japan has bases. All the big powers have bases in Africa. There are thousands of foreign troops in Africa. We've already discussed the invasion or intervention in Libya. Of course, there's also the intervention in Congo, Central African Republic, and one can go on and on and on. So this issue of, this slogan of hands off Africa seems to me extremely relevant, not just from the point of view of military intervention, interference in Africa, but then also there's the economic interference and intervention. And today we've already heard, one doesn't want to enumerate it any longer, the IMF, the World Bank, the EU, the G20, etc., etc., etc. One can reel off these so-called agreements. The current buzzword is partnership. It's like a partnership between the lions and the lambs. Nobody recognises that as a partnership. So this interference in Africa from the big powers is still bedeviling the African continent, in my view, and is a cause of many of the difficulties and problems which face it. But there is another problem which bedevils the continent and which was also addressed in 1958. In fact, a series of problems that not only were addressed in 1958, but the predecessor of 1958, which was 1945. So the 1945 Congress in Manchester, which was jointly organised by Padmore, Nkrumah, Amy Ashford Garvey and others, they identified all the, if you like, the ills confronting the African continent and those things of which they wanted to rid the continent. Some of these were also discussed in 58. One were the colonial borders, which were imposed on Africa in 1884 and 1885, which they said should be got rid of. Second were the, they call what I would call the capital-centered system, which they also said had been imposed on Africa and must be completely rejected. Thirdly, they talked about the alien political institutions, which they said had been imposed on the continent. And many of these things were discussed in 1958, I can go on and on, but they still bedevil the continent. And it's impossible, in my view, as a historian, to break those chains unless these issues are addressed. And the most important one, I guess, are the, we can call the alien political institutions or the alien political thinking which exists. We heard earlier, we keep hearing the famous phrase of Nkrumah's, seek ye first the political kingdom. But the question is, whose political kingdom is being sought? Is it the political kingdom of the colonial powers, the Westminster system, the Paris system, the Washington system, or is it some other system? The political system of the African peoples. That political system has rarely been sought. It has been sought in places. It's even been built in places, but in the majority of places it hasn't. What has been adopted is the Eurocentric political institutions, of which we love so much because we experience them here in Britain, and we know how democratic they are, emanating as they do from the 17th century. What we know about those political institutions is that they don't give the majority of people decision-making power. If they don't give that power in Britain, how will they do that in Africa? So these issues, which were raised in 45 and again in 58 in many different ways, have still not been addressed. And the key of those, I think, is what was recognized again in 45, In 45, you remember that one of the key things which distinguished that Congress was that Padmore and others said, we want a Congress which is based around what they called the masses of the people. In other words, the wealth producers, the workers, farmers, and so on. In 58, they didn't quite go to that extent, although they wanted to involve those who are involved in trade unions, women's organizations, and others, and so on. But in the interim, the conclusions of the 45 Congress, not only that the proceedings should be based on the masses of the people, but that the masses of the people were the main force which was going to end colonial rule, etc., etc. So there's a logical conclusion of that if the masses of the people are the main force to end colonial rule, then the masses of the people must remain the main force. And the political kingdom which is sought and constructed must be one in which the masses of the people are able to empower themselves. Unfortunately, in very few places, I haven't got time much to go into it now, that conclusion has not been carried through, or we can say that the wealth producers, the masses, to use their phrase, have not yet been able to empower themselves in Africa.
Where, Professor, have they been able to empower themselves in the world?
Well, this is we've just celebrated, in fact, the centenary of the first empowerment of the masses of the people, which was the famous revolution in 1917. So that is certainly one example. You contend that in Russia today the masses of the people are empowered? No, I don't contend.
No, I mean asking.
Why would I contend? I'm a historian. You asked me a question and I answered.
I understand where there have been attempts to empower the mass of the people.
No, not to empower the masses of the people. Nobody's interested in empowering other people. What people are interested in is empowering themselves and becoming decision makers.
But the question I have for you is, where should we be looking?
Well, that's exactly where we should be looking.
Where? To where?
That is where we should be looking.
Where?
Well, it's the question is not really for us to be looking, but
I'm asking you as a historian.
Okay. Well, I'm struggling to answer, but you keep interrupting me, so it's very, very difficult. So what I'm arguing is that the solution to these problems of people not being empowered and not being the decision makers in Africa is that those people must empower themselves.
We all agree on that.
Okay, well then that's great.
But we need help as to how to bring it about.
Okay. Oh wow. Okay. Well, that is. If I can use another phrase from the past, which is, "We are our own liberators." That is the task, if I can put it that way. That is the task of people who are in the African continent and who are already engaged in that task. As far as I can gather, whenever I go, whenever I hear what people are doing up and down the continent, that people are striving to realise that task.
Okay. Good. I'm not going to. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you. You would like to say one thing in a minute?
Yeah, I just want to say one other thing, because I want to address Lord Scotland there, if I may, because you raised a very, very important point about the African personality, and I thought that it was going to be addressed in that way. That seemed to me to be what you were raising, this question of African personality, and that it's important for young people of African heritage here in Britain that issue is raised, and I would like to say yes, I agree with that wholeheartedly. That is a problem amongst our young people. It's particularly a problem in the academic world. It's particularly a problem in my own subject of history, where we have very, very few young historians of African or Caribbean heritage. And we must again remember that Pan Africanism is not just an ism of the African continent, but of Africans globally, the continent and the diaspora. So in this country we have a problem which is that in certain areas there is a massive problem of racism and Eurocentrism. And one of those areas is academia, and in particular in the field of history. So I think it's very, very important, the issue you raised about having encouragement, having role models for those younger people who are around, so they can see that it is possible to achieve in certain areas. And obviously that needs to be reflected in panels and speakers and so on. If I was given longer, I could explain what we're doing to address that issue. But I think you raised it from a very important perspective.
Good. Now, we're going to come back to this. Just give me a round of applause.